Sanctions have been imposed on 82 individuals and 29 companies. German payment provider Wirecard went bankrupt on Tuesday.
Russia has launched an unprecedented disinformation campaign against...
Billions of dollars have been found in various offshore accounts.
Welcome to Integrity Insights, the Berlin Risk podcast. Hello, I hope everyone has been enjoying the summer months. We in Berlin here certainly have been enjoying the long days and the lakes. It's been great, but as you can imagine, the world still goes round. There have been some unfortunate developments. We have been following the far right protests in the United Kingdom, and also in this context, recent designations by the United States and especially the European Union of far right groups as terrorist organizations, which is a very significant development on the sanctions front. And we are actually quite lucky to have in our network a great authority on the subject, certainly here in Germany, but also internationally. Hans-Jakob Schindler, who serves as a senior director at Counter Extremism Project and also previously spent many years as a diplomat in German diplomatic services, and has several other roles that he will delve deeper into in this interview. So let's jump straight into our conversation. Right, Hans, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, let's start with a brief introduction. And I think you are actually, out of all the guests that we have so far, you have probably the most extensive kind of academic and professional background. So let's try to keep it brief, but I'm all ears.
Right. Okay. So just to do this very quickly, I'm currently the senior director of the Counter Extremism Project. That is a transatlantic think tank that looks at all forms of extremism and terrorism. So from right-wing extremism that we're going to talk about today, all the way to Islamist extremism and anything in between, including left-wing extremism. And one of the main work streams that we have is really financial crime, sanctions, evasion by terrorists, as well as terrorist financing. We have built up quite a work stream here in our office in Berlin, where I'm right now, focusing on the financing of right-wing extremism, which will be, I think, the focus of our discussion today. Prior to this, starting in the late 1990s, I was an academic at St. Andrews University focusing on international terrorism, then joined the German government in April 2001 as their lead analyst on Al-Qaeda in a place called Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. That became quite an interesting position. Of course, 6 months later when there was the 9/11 attacks, I continued that work until 2005, then was posted to Iran as the advisor to the German ambassador there and the liaison to the Iranian security intelligence forces, followed by me actually leaving the German government again after 10 years in 2011 when I came back from Iran, then joined the private sector as a sanctions advisor, funnily, on of course, counterterrorism financing, but also sanctions and Iran sanctions combating evasion. Until I got an email from the German Foreign Ministry calling me back and said, would you like to go to New York to serve in the Security Council? It was the first time really that Germany had a position available or the ability to suggest to the Security Council to get a German elected.
That is, Hans, the United Nations Security Council.
Yes, that's the United Nations Security Council, yes. A position available in what's called the ISIL Al-Qaeda Taliban Monitoring Team. It's the advisors to the United Nations Security Council on those groups, but more crucially, on the development of the global sanctions regimes that the Security Council maintains against those groups. So technical questions from passenger data to financial transactions, monitoring, to regulations of the arts and antiquity markets is what I did for 5 years, 2.5 of which I was the coordinator, the head of the team until 2018. When after 5 years, my mandate simply automatically ended and I had to leave the United Nations and joined the Counter Extremism Project. And now I do the Counter Extremism Project and sit on the board of a couple of research institutes and companies, all focused on financial crime and sanctions.
And the Counter Extremism Project is based, if I understand it correctly, in New York and in Berlin. And you kind of split your time between the two cities, or how where do you spend your time?
The two physical offices are one in New York and one in Berlin. We operate transatlantic, which means the main office New York, but then we have people in Washington, we have people in Brussels, in London, in France. In Munich we have a couple of people. Newly we have people in Poland. And I simply go back and forth between the two offices. A couple of weeks here in Berlin, a couple of weeks in New York.
So you are not just responsible for the Germany chapter, you also you are responsible for the global operations as well.
Yes, I'm leading the entire organization as far as the content is concerned. So strategic directions, projects that we do with government. One thing that CEP does is really support governments in the development of legislation and regulation on quite a few fields, but the one field that is relevant today is, of course, counter extremism, counterterrorism financing. So I'm also heavily involved in negotiating with various governments, various projects.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating, and it's really great. I'm really grateful that you made the time for us to talk about extremism. And the specific topic that I wanted to talk about today was the recent designations of far-right groups as terrorist organizations in both the European Union and the United States. And when we talk very, very broadly, like very broad question, at the moment, how would you, you have spent so much time in this field looking at religious motivated extremism, and now this far-right extremism coming more and more, right-wing extremism coming more and more into the picture. Like how big the right-wing extremism threat is compared to the traditional religious motivated extremism?
See, that's the problem. When we're talking about big or not big, we're speaking about statistics, right? And so if you're talking about the statistics, how many in Germany are considered part of that milieu by the German intelligence security forces? That's several 10,000. Actually more than are considered to be part of the hardcore Islamist terrorist milieu in Germany. Way more, right? If you're talking about how many crimes are committed by extremist phenomena, right-wing extremism leads the field for a long time. However, of course, if you're talking about what is the individual threat perception, what is really scaring people, it's of course Islamist terrorism, because they do few attacks, but those they do are really spectacular. If you think about what happened in Moscow in March, right, 140 people dead. The fact that we do have nearly daily attacks motivated by right-wing extremists in Germany simply is not in the public's mind as much, because they don't have this fantastically spectacular terror operations, but they do a lot of lower level attacks. And that's the reason really why since 2019, so not just this government, but also the previous government, which, as you remember, had a Bavarian CSU Minister of Interior who is certainly not being accused of being too liberal, even he said that the most sustained and gravest threat to the domestic security of Germany is currently right-wing extremism, not Islamist terrorism. Remains a threat, but remains more or less a stable threat, while right-wing extremism has been growing fairly exponentially in the last couple of years.
Which is, I suppose, also the reason why earlier this year the US Department of State designated an organization called Nordic Resistance Movement as specially designated global terrorists, and only a month later the European Union, for the first time ever, included a far-right entity, the BASE, organization called the BASE, on its list of terrorist entities. Is there a reason for this timing, for this particular timing, why these things are happening now?
Well, I mean, first of all, there is a problem with designation of terrorism. So while all the laws in the United States at the level of the European Union are not saying anything about Islamist terrorism when they define terrorism, and when they define what groups would be eligible to be included in these counterterrorism lists, if you read through it, it's really been formulated with Al-Qaeda in mind, right? So it has to be hierarchical, it has to have a clear command and control structure, it has to have a clear threat to the US homeland, but must not involve US individuals in the leadership of that hierarchy, yada, yada, yada. Same thing the other way around for the European Union. So we are now, however, facing a slightly different structured threat here, because the one difference between Islamist terrorist groups like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah and right-wing extremism is that we are talking, by and large, of a leaderless movement that orders itself into networks who do not necessarily have a clear command and control structure, and who, apart from individual perpetrators who write these ridiculous manifestos all the time, these groups never take responsibility for any of the terror. This is the explanation why so few groups are designated. It is a little bit, in my opinion, embarrassing for the Europeans that the Americans have already designated 2 groups, and really you should see this as the latest Nordic resistance movement as a extension of the earlier designation. So the very, very first designation of a right-wing extremist group in the United States as a globally designated terror organization was the Russian Imperial Movement, ironically under the Trump administration, because the Russian Imperial Movement had trained some Scandinavians in Petersburg who then went back to Sweden and bombed a whole bunch of migration centers in 2015 and 16, then got convicted, right? And so you had like a clear hierarchical, the Russian Imperial Movement is super hierarchical. It had held a training camp, right? It organized terrorists, sent them to a foreign country, and they bombed stuff. So that really was like one-on-one Al-Qaeda in the late 1990s, so it seemed to be easier. Now, however, those individuals used to be, before they became convicted, members of the Nordic resistance movement. Obviously, the Nordic resistance movement immediately disavowed them, said, they're 4 members, nothing to do with us, yada, yada, yada. And that designation now by the US government of the Nordic resistance movement, also as a terrorist organization, really indicates that they simply don't believe this disavowment. These guys, and I don't believe this disavowment. So this would be good ideas for the European Union to designate both the Russian Imperial Movement as well as the Nordic Resistance Movement, but they haven't. They chose the base. At the moment, a purely online movement that is doing propaganda, not many operations at this point. So I'm not quite sure why, the base was the first one that they could all agree on. As I said, Nordic Resistance Movement, Hammerskins, Atomwaffen Division, Feuerkriegsdivision. There are many, many networks that I would think would have been far easier, far more obvious to designate rather than the base. But that's where we are. So the Americans designated a Russian and a European group, and we designated an American group. The leader of the base actually is now housed in Moscow. But it is actually an American online phenomenon. Not necessarily with a big base, now small b, a big base in Europe.
And it's basically, it should be understood more as a anti-Russian sanctions as opposed to far-right extremism sanctions.
No, I mean, you do remember the attitude of Donald Trump towards President Vladimir Putin when he was president. So certainly it wasn't the intention to do it anti-Russia, but certainly it was a clear signal from OFAC and the State Department that right-wing extremism is now also considered terrorism. I mean, these were bomb attacks that these individuals did in Sweden. It was not something low-level or undangerous.
And I mean, you already mentioned this European designations, the group, the base. Do you have any kind of insights? I mean, you said that you don't really understand why they chose this organization, which is US links, and the leader is based in Moscow. But how do you interpret this, this decision suddenly as also just made just one month after the US designation?
Yeah, but I don't think that the base designation has anything to do with the US designations. I do know that there were several groups that were discussed, and of course the legal advice from the Commission was that the base fulfills all the criteria. Now, what the detailed arguments of the legal department of the European Commission is, I don't know. I haven't seen the document. But I know that they had several groups under consideration, and the base is the first one where they said yes. So let me make clear, I don't want to knock that designation, right? So first of all, there is only just about over 40 individuals and groups that the European Union outside ISIL and Al-Qaeda has listed as terrorists, right? So there is the ISIL Al-Qaeda list of the EU, which is At the moment, still 100 or nearly 100% the United Nations Security Council sanctions list, and then they have developed a separate regime for Al-Qaeda and ISIL that the EU now can designate their own individuals, and a handful has already been on that list. And then the rest are just really strange groups, some communist party in Southeast Asia that no one remembers why they were on that list ever. But then also Hamas, Hezbollah, and the important groups. So it's not like the US list where you have hundreds and thousands of individuals and groups. You have a handful. And now designating a right-wing extremist network is a very, very important sign that the European Union finally has begun seeing this for what it is. It is not an individualized domestic nuisance. It is actually a developing terrorism threat with much stronger transnational connectivity than it had about a decade ago, based on new narratives like the Great Replacements theory, white genocide, and others that allow these groups who really hated each other in the 1990s, right, that the Poles and the Germans say, okay, for the time being, right, I still hate foreigners and I potentially hate you, but we're both white. And now we need to fight together against the brown the people and the migrants and people of color and anything that is bad in our society, which means globalization, LGBTQ, all of these issues that constantly come up. And there's now a common enemy, which includes those foreigners in inverted commas, but also, compatriots. So Germans who are liberal politicians or pro-migrant politicians are now a target. And we had a German politician from the Conservative Party being executed, Walter Lübcke, right, a couple of years ago here in Germany, because he was working diligently to house migrants that were part of this big migrant wave from 2015 onwards.
So, Hans, if you are saying that the European authorities and also the authorities in the US are recognizing more and more this threat, and in the light of these two recent designations, do you expect way more of these designations to come in the months to come?
I mean, my organization, I myself, others are lobbying very hard on both sides of the Atlantic to say, okay, this is a very good beginning, but a beginning. So we really do need to make sure that we continue to set these markers, right? It's not going to be possible to ever list all of the networks and groups that conduct violence and are right-wing extremist, motivated by right-wing extremist or anti-Semitic narratives. But at least as the German government does very diligently on its domestic banning lists of organizations, where every couple of months the next network, the next right-wing extremist group is banned. Now a right-wing extremist key journal, Compact, was banned, right? This is important to keep the scene, the milieu on its toes, to drive it ahead of you, to force it constantly to reorganize, occur operational costs, disrupt their financing, right? So finally the German government in its strategy last year and its update this year against right-wing extremism clearly says financing is one of the top priorities of what we're going to do going forward fighting this phenomena, and we want to disrupt those networks that generate those financing. So it's a real emphasis. But in order to enable all of the instruments that we already have, i.e. counterterrorism financing instruments, rather than having to look at other elements, and we at CEP have actually developed a strategy, what administrative tools or tax evasion tools could be used to disrupt financing if you don't have the counterterrorism financing tools at your hand, right? In order to avoid having to do just that, but use all of the also developed private sector defensive systems against counterterrorism financing, you need to declare this as terrorism. And ideally at the European level to have an equal implementation across the entire Union.
And the sanctions as they are now, how do they actually affect these organizations once they get designated?
Well, look, I mean, if you just have the base on the list, nothing really happens. This is a more or less political signal. Obviously, that's the hope. Will also now, first time, raise awareness within the financial industry within virtual asset service providers, within other designated entities, reporting entities, that this is now a phenomenon on par with other terrorist phenomena, and you better start reading up on this and begin to understand how this works, because there will be more down the pipeline. That's number one. Number two, of course, anyone related to the base, wanting to do financial transactions, hopefully, will have a little bit of a harder time now in Europe. But it's the beginning of a long road. We are not there yet compared to Islamist terrorism.
And when we talk about the financing, what are the main, when you look at kind of like across the field of the far-right extremist groups, what are the main ways these organizations get financed or raise funds?
Well, I mean, I am really proud to say that the Counter Extremism Project, actually with some help from someone you know, were really the first organization to really systematically analyze the financial income streams of right-wing extremism. I think first time in Europe and North America for sure, but beyond that, I'm sure as well. This is really 7 income streams. So let me make sure that I don't forget one. First one is the traditional one, and until just a couple of years ago, that was considered to be the main, if not the only income stream. That's basically donations and self-financing, right? And in that respect, we also have, at least as far as Europe is concerned, virtual asset cryptocurrencies really playing a role here, right, in the collection of donations. The second income stream is anything to do with music. The biggest right-wing extremist music scene worldwide actually happens to be in Germany. So big industry, companies who produce music, manage bands, sell that music online and offline, right? Offline at events, but also online in their online shops. Then combat sports, from gyms to managing teams, and anything connected with that is an income stream. Then we do have the whole event space, concerts, but also combat sports tournaments, sometimes integrated, hundreds of small concerts a year, and a couple of really big international concerts where everyone comes together. Then you have the income stream from sale of merchandise that goes beyond the music. You can now buy your protein powder from your neighborhood Nazi online if you like so. But you can also buy literature, and you can, your crossbow and your knife to knife down your next migrant that you meet. All of this is readily available, and really tragically readily available still on the global platforms. Because what these guys have learned is the easiest thing to get around your moderation rules of your Facebook or your Instagram or your YouTube, where you want to sell that stuff, is simply to present a top layer of really nice pictures. No hate, no crossbows, no Hitler paraphernalia, just really smiling people wearing T-shirts, obviously hateful stuff on the T-shirts, but from kids to women, in wonderful, pretty colors. You're just an online store that sells T-shirts, right? So please don't look at what says on the T-shirts, but we're just selling T-shirts very differently from a couple of years ago. And then there's a link. And when you click on that link, you get to the second actual layer of the store. And there you got the whole thing. You got your right-wing extremist literature, you got your knives and your crossbows and your steel helmets, what the heart's content for any fascist, what they need, right? So that's the online and offline store thing. This has led to so much profits that we have seen now investments in real estate. Sometimes investments in real estate simply to park some money. Other times investments in real estate really to make a profit, right? We've seen some American militia buying real estate in African American neighborhoods in Chicago. Really, I mean, this is not a DEI operation here of this right-wing extremist militia, right? Diversity, inclusion, and project. This is really an investment because they know this is a gentrifying area in the city, and they will be able to sell this, a couple of years ago with the hefty profit. And here in Germany, in particular, we've seen investment in real estate also to generate what they call safe spaces, right? i.e., if you have an event and you have it in your private house or in your private castle, it's much harder to actually ban the event from going ahead. We have seen here in Eastern Germany a couple of real estate projects where they're attempting to buy every single parcel of land in a village to create these kind of white villages, right? And then finally, of course, real estate is always a wonderful thing to launder money, because who knows what the real worth of real estate is, and it depends on what you write on your invoice, right? So that leads me to the last income stream, which is involvement in organized crime. We had here the Turonen being now, after 36 times being convicted between 9 individuals over the last couple of years for violent crimes, now for the first time being convicted as a drug distribution network. So there is a great overlap between parts of the right-wing extremism milieu and the organized crime milieu, in particular outlaw motorcycle gangs, right? Common membership, common recruitment, cooperation when it comes to the transport and distribution of illegal drugs or weapons. And that's really is the final income stream, and the easier one to attack if you understand that this is not a small drug ring, but it's a small drug ring that earns money for right-wing extremist causes and activists and for their operations.
And when we stick to the German example, which I imagine, given that you have done so much work in Germany, you have most experience with, how has the law enforcement kind of reacted to these findings? Have you seen some particular measures that tackled those financing streams?
Yeah, look, I mean, they're slowly catching on to the idea that there is more that you can do than to convict them just for the violence they're meting out, right? So there is a tax investigations against a really famous right-wing extremist in East Germany right now, who had run a couple of restaurants and stores, and there is now simply a tax evasion investigation against him. Then, of course, the German federal government has now written a strategy where they say this is about the financing, and we will use all available means, whether it's taxes or regulations violation or any other opportunity that we get to disrupt that network there. So at the moment, everyone is still grappling with this situation. The understanding is growing that this is serious and that this is a growing threat, but we are nowhere near the level of investigative sophistication that we have on the Islamist terrorist side.
And last question, Hans, you mentioned some of the work that you did with the Counter Extremism Project, and I know myself that you have done a lot of fantastic research. There's a lot of reports. For anyone who is interested, where can people find this material, and is it available for anyone?
Yes, so I mean, apart from the actual lists with the names and addresses or the details of the counter strategy that we are suggesting to the various governments, everything else is online. So the analysis of how the financing works, where the weaknesses in the financing are all available on our website, www.counterextremism.com, and then you choose CEP Germany, and then under publications you get all of these reports, most of which are in German and English. Only very few are just in German. But the basic ones are all in English as well. You can find it there. My colleague Alexander Ritzmann has done fantastic work in this work stream over the last couple of years. So if you Google his name, Alexander Ritzmann, you'll also get to those reports. It's maybe even the easier route to get there.
Fantastic. And I can really highly recommend. I read many of those reports myself. And yeah, for anyone who is interested in the subject, it's a great read. Hans, thank you very much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure, and it's very, very relevant, timely subject. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Anytime again.